everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. If I'd asked any one of us about 2 years ago what it meant to take a risk or what it meant to be at risk, I think we'd have had a very different answer from the one we'd give today. Something that COVID and this year and a half of living in a global pandemic has done is that it's made us reassess what we think of when we say risk or what risk even means. Suddenly, for many of us who possibly only really think of risk when anything from going out alone at night or having to take a long drive by yourself to jumping out of a plane with a parachute, suddenly, even for those people, risk has become something that is deeply personal and is with you at all times. Suddenly, the little things that you do, whether you wear a mask, whether you actually go out to meet somebody, if you're sitting close to somebody, if you're going to see your grandparents for the next 6 months, all of these things are somehow tied up in the idea and our understanding of risk. Now, the reality is that many of us have been living lives far before COVID that existed with this kind of risk intact in our everyday. When I was 11 years old, I found the word gay in an Oxford dictionary. And of course, my curiosity piqued at the related words, and I checked all of them, and one of them was lesbian. And I, read the description of what that meant, and I had a bit of an aha moment. I hadn't, at 11, I didn't necessarily fully comprehend all it was saying. I didn't fully comprehend why it spoke to me in any way. But there I was, looking at this word thinking, there's something familiar about that, or that feels like that could be me. People underestimate how much children understand, especially about themselves and their love and their desire and their sense of self, even if it is a sense of self that is constantly changing and growing. In that moment, even with the perhaps little understanding I had of the world, especially because I came from a protected family that was deeply privileged and protected me, I knew in that moment that I had to make a choice. I had to either choose between what felt real to me, what felt like myself, what felt like my genuine self, and what the world wanted me to be. I may not have understood I may not have fathomed what it meant to even choose yourself, honestly, in that moment. Yet somehow even this 11-year-old self understood that were I to choose myself, I would probably be putting myself in great harm. I would probably be choosing a life of a great deal of hardship that I didn't even know what that meant yet, but I knew the feeling. My gut knew that that choice was one that I would have to live with. And I made a deal with myself that day. Thinking back, honestly, I'm not even sure how I did it. I'm surprised at my own 11-year-old self. But on that day, I made a deal that if I was to choose myself, if I was to choose my truth and living the way that I wanted, that was honest to me, then I would never turn back. I would never look back and regret making that choice. That I would always be truthful to myself and who I am. And I've lived that truth, sometimes with great difficulty, but I have lived that truth. I made that pact with myself and I kept it. A big part of why I was able to even imagine this choice, why it was even a choice for me, even at that age, was because I am very lucky to come from a deeply privileged family. I come from a deeply privileged background in two ways. One, in just our social setting, in the fact that I know, and I knew even then, that my coming out at the very least would not mean that I would face violence or that I would be kicked out of my home. And for many people, as basic as that sounds, for many people that is a reality, and that is something they truly have to consider when they imagine whether they should come out or not, or when they even let themselves believe that there is a choice. And the other was that I came from a family that was full of artists and activists. Now, there's a pretty good setting to come from, especially when you're picking a life like this, because you've already seen many people speak their truths, whatever those are. Even though I came from a family where I was able to get by for years without really having to be face to face with a lot of the hardships that many, many people in this country face. I realized through the years, but especially when I was 17, that even that bubble is not impenetrable. That the risk of living your version of yourself and not the one that the society gives you or hopes that you will play or forces you to play, it'll come back and bite you at some point or another. And this happened to me when a local newspaper decided to out me. I was 17, I was a minor. So, in any hopeful, ideal society, this would not even be possible. This would be against the law. But there I was, front page, full photo of me, after having been tricked into giving an interview under the premise of something completely different. I wasn't given an opportunity to speak for myself. I wasn't given an opportunity to tell the people that didn't know. My grandmother, for instance, I hadn't had an open conversation with her. However, even in that, I was lucky enough that between 11 and 17, I had had years to work on myself to become who I wanted to be, even though that is something I'm still figuring out and it changes every day. But I had grounded myself enough and told enough people that even in that, my own risk was far less than what it would have been for many, many others, because for many others in this country, it could have meant their life. Nonetheless, there I was, 17, suddenly, not only the city that I came from, but many, many other cities picked up this very sensational article and ran it in 4 or 5 major cities across the country. It was not easy. For many, many reasons. I lost many friends because their parents decided that I wasn't somebody to be safe with, or I wasn't safe to be around anymore. People I've known all my life. My family got hate mail for months, but we got through it. I got through it. And yet the thing that was perhaps the hardest was not something like that happening. The things that was the hardest for me, and I am now, having worked with the queer community for so many years, now I'm sure that not just for me, but for most of us, was the amount of isolation and loneliness that I felt in all those years. Believe it or not, it was not till I was 18 that I actually met a real live other queer person who was out and presented as queer. That's 18 years of your life, imagining that you are the only one, not seeing yourself in movies or books or in your family or anywhere else, and truly believing that you are the only one who exists like this. It's an incredibly difficult way to live, and many, many queer adults, as much as queer youth, struggle with this isolation and loneliness and alienation. Part of my privilege allowed me to go away to college when I was 18, and I went to New York City and I went to Sarah Lawrence College, which I was very lucky was a majority of queer people. I realized I had gone from a desert right into the ocean. It wasn't what I had expected, but what it was for the first time, I was surrounded by people who I could look at and think of myself as one of. It was the first time I understood what it meant to have community, to be represented in one way or another, to see yourself and not feel like you are a complete alien. It completely changed my life. I realized that I had been living in a self-imposed fishbowl while I was back home because that was enough to survive. I think we don't realize how shackled we are until we see what freedom is possible. When I came back home 4 years later, that was the real culture shock for me, coming back home. Because I was in a place that I loved and I knew and that was familiar, yet it was a place that I did not fit in, that I could not fit in any way. It was at this point that I really began thinking about what it meant for people who did not have the privilege that I did, and all the kinds of lives that people lived while trying to be queer and while trying to negotiate their own queer lives while still staying alive and still being safe and still living there every day. QueerAbad was an answer to this, and it has done many things in the last 5 years of it being around. But perhaps something that we constantly face and come up against is this idea that queerness is not Indian, is not our own, is not local in any way. And it's baffled me for years, because something that you feel so deep in your heart, that is in your bones, how can that be a concept from somewhere else? How can that not be just another deeply important part of who you are as a human being? I think I was very lucky in the life that I have led and where I came from, and even with the great risks that I have taken in being seen so that other people can see me and so that I can embody the things that I needed when I was a child, when I desperately needed to see other queer people. I have tried to become that by just living truthfully, by holding true to that pact I made with my 11-year-old self. And the thing is, we can become the versions of ourselves that our children will need, that our youngsters will need, that other generations will need. We can be the ones who are seen, especially those of us who come from privilege. And there will always be people who tell you, this is not something we do. This is not something we do in our country, in our religion, in our caste, in our culture. But the truth is that there is nothing more scary than change. And for a lot of people who have lived the same way and seen the same things, the reason they are saying these things is because they are deeply, deeply afraid. But if tradition and culture is not rooted in celebrating who we are and rooted in celebrating who we are in ourselves as individuals, but also who we are as a community when we are with each other, then it's not worthy a tradition to take ahead to keep on living. If it only tells us that we are wrong and that we are sinful or that we are bad and against everything that the people around us believe, then those are not traditions that I will ever uphold. I think traditions and norms can't be fixed in time. They must change and grow to reflect the people embodying and enacting them in the everyday. Exactly as time changes and everything with it changes, these two are things that must change. Otherwise, we will be. Nature tells us over and over again that if we are stagnant, if we are still, then there will be stagnation, there will be death, there will be rot. We cannot expect our children to live in worlds where they are not allowed to be their full selves. We must rejoice who we are. And those of us who can do that in a way that the rest of the world can see have a responsibility to do so. I want to end today's talk with a poem that I wrote a few years ago. And I think it follows my journey till today in many ways. And I hope that it inspires you to follow yours as well. His poem is called Queer. My queer self has been mislabeled, mistaken for many things since birth. She has been assumed straight away to be the same, perfectly same. My queer body has tried on every size, has grown too far to fit any narrow mind, has been cloaked in the lies woven into the very fabric of history, of your imaginations for me. My queer feet have danced in shoes placed before me that would not fit, could not be my own, have tried to hide the scars of my journey that only begin down there, curling upwards in embrace, tracing each story over razor's edge till the million blades of my hair. My queer tongue has spelt out words incorrectly for myself, for my safety, for your comfort, has been held to not displace your sense of security, your privilege. My queer soul has raged, screaming within the walls of my body, a form inherited at birth. It has longed for escape, banging against the inside. It has torn away at the fiction of my changing realities. My queer heart has been broken, rebuilt, endlessly in search for the truth, for a truth that I am creating every day, reinventing. My queerness has become and is done with you. Thank you for listening.